I'd like to thank all of you for coming, and together with my colleagues, Jordan T. Camp, Christina Heatherton, and Manu Karuga from the program in American Studies at Barnard College. We're very happy to have with us here Professor Laleh Khalili from SOAS. The event is co-sponsored by the Racial Capitalism Working Group in the Center for the Study of Social Difference, the Department of Anthropology, the Middle East Institute, and the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life, and the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies. Professor Khalili is the author of Heroes and Martyrs of Palestine, The Politics of National Commemoration from Cambridge, 2007. She edited Modern Arab Politics, 2008 for Routledge, and co-edited with Gillian Schweder, Policing and Prisons in the Middle East, Formations of Coercion, Hearst, Oxford University Press, 2010. Her most recent book, Time in the Shadows, Confinement in Counterinsurgencies from Stanford, 2013, drew on interviews with former detainees of Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo Bay, and various Israeli detention camps and prisons, and military officers, guards, and interrogators, as well as a large number of archival sources to show the continuities in practices of detention in liberal counterinsurgencies from the Boer War until today. Time in the Shadows was the winner of the Susan Strange Best Book Prize in the British International Studies Association and the 2014 Best Book Award of the International Political Sociology section of the ISA. And we very look forward to today's lecture, which is titled Tankers, Tycoons, and the Making of Modern Regimes of Law, Labor, and Finance. Please join me in welcoming Professor Laleh Khalili.
First, I don't write for Iranian.com anymore because once I started working on the Arab world, I was disowned. Somewhat, I'm just joking. Second, I am desperately nervous. There's so many friends and colleagues and current and former students that this is terrifying. So forgive me if I stumble, sweat, get red, embarrass myself generally. Most importantly, I really want to thank these guys sitting up here, Christina, Manu, Naor, and Jordan, for organizing both this talk and the talk tomorrow. And I'm hoping to meet some grad students tomorrow as well, despite the blizzard. So if you're going to brave it, so am I. I also want to say that this talk is kind of brand new research. Since the counterinsurgency stuff, I've actually been working on a research project on shipping and maritime transportation in the Arabian Peninsula. There's a book coming out with Verso, hopefully in the autumn, from that. But the stuff that I'm going to be presenting today is not in the book. It's actually stuff that I've done that draws from some of the elements in the book, but which is going to be new research. Now, since I wrote this paper about a week ago, I've actually completely and totally changed my mind about what should go in it. So please feel free to have at it, because it's a draft. Okay. I want to first start with a fabulous quote that I ran into in a New York Times from 23rd of September 1956. It was by one of the regular writers, and it was from a piece titled "The Tanker, Queen of the Seas." And the quote was, "Just as the triremes, galleass, longboat, and clipper were symbols of their own maritime eras, so the tanker is the ship of our century." In some ways, this is about this quotation. Okay. So in 1967, the British Transport Dock Board commissioned McKinsey & Company, the management consulting firm, to produce a report on containerization. That year was a cataclysmic year in post-war British history. At the end of 1967, Prime Minister Harold Wilson had decreed withdrawal from the British colony at Aden, where BP, British Petroleum, had its largest refinery east of Suez. The refinery was built after the nationalization of the company's oil and refinery in Iran in 1951. Domestically, in Britain, throughout the year, dockers in the country's two most major ports, London and Liverpool, had gone on crippling strikes to decasualize the hiring process at the docks. They used to stand at the docks, they were brought in to work for the day, and what they were looking for was to decasualize that labor and become actually salaried workers. As the Minister of Labour, R.J. Gunther, reported to the Parliament, and I quote, "There has been a virtually complete strike of dockers in Liverpool and Birkenhead since 18th of September. In London, the Royal Group, West India, and Millwall Docks, and to a lesser extent, London and St. Katharine's Docks, have also been affected. These strikes, which are unofficial, now involve about 16,000 men and have caused serious interference with trade, in particular with exports." End quote. In this climate, containerization was seen as a major palliative to this unruly and intransigent workforce, whose demand for better wages and working conditions was eating into the profits of the shipping companies. Dockside protests around decasualization were restricting the circulation of goods and raw resources that had been so fundamental a factor in the post-Second World War boom in Europe. Mackenzie's suggestion for the process of containerization was the mechanization of the docks via containerization, which it argued would better utilize, and I quote, "material resources through improved process control." More importantly, Mackenzie promised that, quote unquote, "expensive labor can be replaced with cheaper capital equipment." End quote. The promise of automation as a solution to unruly dockers, Mackenzie reasoned, was already proven in another maritime transport sector. They said, "The distribution of petroleum products is highly automated. The combined use of supertankers, high-speed automatic pumps, and large-capacity inland pipeline result in an extremely efficient integrated transport system," end quote. This capital investment inevitably drove a process of monopolization in business structures and economies of scale in the material plant needed for shipping. But Mackenzie showed that in the oil industry, these economies of scale had resulted in a staggering cost saving of up to 30% per unit of shipping. So there's an odd tanker-shaped lacuna in both the vast literature on petroleum and the growing corpus of critical maritime and logistical studies. The brilliant literature on logistics, and here I include the work not only of Deb Cowan in her Deadly Life of Logistics, and the forthcoming research of Charmaine Chua and others sitting in this room, actually, but also the much older essays of Alan Sekula, who actually absolutely and totally defines the contours of the field. This work, this brilliant literature on logistics, fits well into the renewed interest in histories of capitalism. But because of its emphasis on global supply chains and how it facilitates value in motion of finished factory products, the transport of crude oil, which is a raw commodity, obviously, and even processed hydrocarbons are often left out of the story. In a vernacular sense, the aesthetics of the container, their geometric symmetries and the dramatic vistas they produce on decks and docks, are also easily overshadow the inelegance of tank farms and the plain, low-slung, liquid bulk carriers they feed. The scholarship on petroleum largely focuses on the production of oil, and the form of circulation most of interest to scholars seems to be pipelines. Only one historic monograph is dedicated to the development of tankers, though of course brief mentions are made in various histories of oil, while memoirs of Euro-American tanker captains and crew abound, but are often not used. Tim Mitchell's Carbon Democracy is an exception to the paucity of critical accounts of maritime circulation of oil. In a brief but perspicuous passage of about 3 pages, he outlines the way pipelines were intended to circumvent the wage demands of the teamsters who transported barrels of oil to the rail depots in horse-drawn wagons. This is at the end of the 19th century, or mid to end of 19th century. Nevertheless, as Mitchell points out, by 1970, maritime transport of petroleum and its refined products accounted for some 60% of global seaborne trade. He also incisively and concisely shows that, and I quote, "moving oil by sea eliminated the labor of coal heavers and stokers, and thus the power of organized workers to withdraw their labor from a critical point in the energy system. Transoceanic shipping operated beyond the territorial spaces governed by labor regulations and other democratic rights won in the era of widespread coal and railway strikes," end quote. It's from page 38, if anybody's interested. It's a really great 3 pages. Seriously, it's like everything that you want laid out there. What I want to do in this essay is to focus on those moments and places where such limitations and restrictions on the activity of labor worked, and other places where it didn't. I will be speaking about the arbitrage on transnational wages of which maritime oil transport in its earliest days took advantage, and the possibility and limits political mobilization offered the workers who struck on decks and docks of tank ships. But tankers also underwrote other significant changes. The maritime transportation of petroleum and its refined products has from the very first foretold a number of disciplinary techniques central to the operation of capital. The distinctiveness of the ownership structures in tanker trade is perhaps one place where containerization has not followed in its footsteps. But in other areas, tanker transport has anticipated automation, offshoring, legal arbitration, and the centrality of speculative finance to its pricing, and by extension to the pricing of oil itself. And so in some senses, it has anticipated a whole lot of different kinds of things that we see both in oil production and in containerization. Petroleum terminals were the first to redraw ports' urban maps in ways now familiar with containerized harbors. And dispute resolution over the circulation of oil has been a crucial element of Lex Petrolia, the legal and arbitral corpus that set the parameters of extraction and circulation of oil. Itself provides a ground on which late capitalist legal property regimes are founded. What I will do here is to trace these anticipatory moments in order to complicate not only the much older genealogies and practices so central to our world today, automation, arbitration, and offshoring, but to also illustrate the limits and vulnerabilities of this form of enterprise, which amalgamates extraction on neocolonial terms, value-added production characteristic of late capitalism, and mercantile modalities of operation. The birth of tank ships. The first ships carrying oil across the Atlantic were sailing ships with a cargo of wooden barrels, and they were primarily owned by British trading companies who carried oil like they would any other cargo in packets, in barrels, which is why even today we measure oil in barrels rather than in tons. Though the wooden barrels were later exchanged for tins, literally made out of tins, that packed more efficiently because they were not round but rather square, the carriage of oil and other petroleum products in bulk across the ocean was still some time in the making. In the 1880s, even after sailing ships were fitted with tanks to carry oil in bulk, some 90% of transatlantic trade was still carried in packets. So despite the fact that tanks were invented and put on sailing ships, they still carried barrels or tins. The first steamer and tank ships were deployed, however, not on the transatlantic routes, but for traversing the Caspian and the deepwater rivers, such as Volga in Russia, by the Swedish Nobel family of the Nobel Peace Prize fame, who owned one of the largest oil companies in Azerbaijan. These ships, first floated in 1878, were made of steel, had tanks that could expand or contract with temperature changes, so they were made out of metal. They had ventilation to expel gases produced by lighter hydrocarbons like kerosene, and perhaps most importantly, they had steam engines operating not on coal, but on fuel oil. So in fact, they were sort of a self-reproducing machinery for transport. In part, the innovation of using fuel oil-operated ships in Azerbaijan came about because in the US, Standard Oil primarily produced kerosene and was not, Standard Oil itself, which was the main oil company at that stage, was not, at least until the end of the century, actually involved in the actual transatlantic shipping of the oil to Europe, where the primary market was at the time. And for a few decades still, Standard Oil was dependent on English merchant marines who would rather convert their oil sale ships than to risk investment in the more costly and as yet unproven tank ships that were steaming in the Caspian region. But in fact, it was an English maritime merchant house whose trade to Asia first tested the possibility of transoceanic tanker trade. By 1888, Standard Oil and a number of smaller British trading firms carrying oil produced by the Nobels and the Rothschilds Benito Company from Azerbaijan had cornered the trade in Asia. So these companies were competing for a new market in Asia. Marcus Samuel, who actually was an Iraqi Jew, but who had been born in Whitechapel in London, so in East End of London, was operating his own trading company, whose first product, it was his father's company, whose first product was decorative shells, which they imported from Southeast Asia. And therefore, the company was called Shell Transport and Trade Company. Marcus Samuel decided to actually approach Benito, the Rothschilds oil firm, after a bunch of negotiations where they also tried to approach the Nobels, and the Nobels weren't very interested. And so the Rothschilds had built a pipeline from Azeri Fields to Batum on the Black Sea. It's a Georgian port on the Black Sea. And so Marcus Samuel decided to start lifting oil from Batum on the Black Sea. But he also wanted to send this ship from Georgia or Azerbaijani oil, with Azerbaijani oil, out to Asia. But in order to do so, he obviously had to go through the Suez Canal. His ships had to go through the Suez Canal. But in addition to that, there was also another problem at issue. For the transportation of oil in bulk to work, destination ports also needed to be fitted for this new product. So they required the following, and I'm quoting from a biography of Marcus Samuel. What they needed was accessibility to road or rail, or both, foundation firms enough for the immense storage tanks that were going to take up the oil from the ships, enough room beside the storage tanks for the warehouses where the bulk oil would be put into barrels for transport inland or for the wholesale trade, piers or jetties in deep water where the new larger tankers, the largest in the world, could come alongside, shelter from violent gales, the Sumatra squalls as they would call them, which could spring up unexpectedly at any time. So from the very first, tankers anticipated the forms of vertical integration or integration along the whole of the transportation chain, which has become a hallmark of container transport. Even more importantly, national allegiances mattered in Marcus Samuel's business. In this instance, the Suez Canals to Britain and also to the Rothschild investors, Lloyd's of London's declaration of Shell tank ship safety, and the ability to circumvent Dutch control in Southeast Asia and court British colonial officers in Asia, all of these things helped Marcus Samuel's Shell Trading Company to become one of the progenitors of a future oil giant, Royal Dutch Shell. By the early years of the 20th century, and as sources of oil diversified, with a concession first granted to a Dutch tobacco planter by the Dutch colonial government in what was to become Indonesia, this first concession was in 1885, and later the first concession in the Gulf was granted by Iran to the British in 1901. So the sources were diversifying. The trade in oil slowly became more widespread globally and beyond the transatlantic routes. But it was only after the Second World War, the reconstruction in Europe and Japan, the war in Korea, and the rocketing of energy-intensive industries, not only in the global north, but in the newly decolonized countries of the global south, that the global trade in oil became the behemoth it did. Even in 1900, oil was only 2.5% of world energy consumption, and tankers were only 1.5% of total merchant tonnage. By 1938, oil had risen to 26% of world's energy consumptions, and tankers were 16% of world tonnage. At the height of the oil boom in 1972, nearly 60% of the world's seaborne trade, as I mentioned, was liquid hydrocarbons, though that percentage plunged after 1973 and today hovers somewhere around 30%. Now, this is a little capsule history, but what is interesting is that this history anticipates automation and urban transformation. From the very first, fuel oil-operated tank ships operated on the basis of maximal exploitation of ever-shrinking numbers of laborers. In fact, the success of the Shell Trading Company was largely predicated on the kind of wage arbitrage that today characterizes global production, shifting work from places with oft-unionized higher-wage workers to places where workers are less protected and may demand lower wages. The Rothschilds Benito Company wanted to open the Asian market to their Azeri oil. They argued that the benefit of bulk transport of oil was that the oil could be unloaded and packed in the Far East rather than at the point of production, where, and I quote, an inexhaustible reservoir of cheap labor, end quote, could fill and pack unloaded oil in fresh, unrusted tin packaging ready for the market, instead of what Standard Oil was doing, which was sending packed oil in tins that eventually became rusty over the course of the travel across the Pacific to Asia. The British did not warm up to the Rothschilds' idea because the tin containers produced and packed in the Far East were going to replace Welsh tin produced in Wales, and because British merchants carried Standard Oil from the US to the rest of the world and would have to compete with Azeri oil produced by a French company. What finally persuaded the British government was the Rothschilds pairing up with Marcus Samuel. In the end, the venture proved highly successful. Skilled Chinese laborers in the Eastern and Southeast Asian ports manufactured tin containers, helped pack them with oil from the tanks, and transported them inland for sale in tins. So in fact, wage arbitrage paid handsomely for Benito and Shell and opened new markets for oil from Azerbaijan. It was also in the nature of tanker trade that portside work could be automated from the first. For example, while emptying the hold of a ship from packages, from barrels or tins, would require dozens, even hundreds of stevedores, depending on how big the ship was, loading and unloading tankers required really only 3 dock workers. Maybe more, but really only 3 dock workers. And I'm quoting here from somebody who was traveling around Arabia and was talking about one of these early loading points. 1 at the tank farm on the ridge to turn on the main tap, 1 worker at the switchgate manifold handling an intricate system of dials by which to guide the required product at the right rate to separate tankers, which is a task rendered recently more complicated by the export of refined products as well as crude, and a 3rd man in a little office on the jetty beside the tanker to supervise the loading. So you only needed 3 people. In fact, this parsimony in the required number of workers was a major factor in Aristotle Onassis' decision after the Second World War to focus his investment on tankers rather than on ore carriers or general cargo ships, as most other Greek ship owners had done, and that's where the tycoon comes in. As one of his biographers, as one of Onassis' biographers wrote, tankers were the most automated ships at that time. This is in the immediate post-Second World War. Hook up a hose, turn a valve, and a tanker was loaded in half the time it would take to pack a freighter's hold using clumsy slings and cargo winches. It took dozens of stevedores to load a freighter, and these men cost money thanks to strong unions controlling such ports as New York and London. Oil could be siphoned aboard with as few as 6 men if the unions weren't looking, end quote. The fact that ships had fewer sailors required fewer dock workers, and everything depended on the speed of the pump, meant that the turnaround time at the port was also much faster. As a 1956 report on work aboard tankers commented, quote, "At sea, the tanker man lives pretty much as does the freighter man, except that there is more of it. For the big tanker spends little time in port. She is in the afternoon to start spilling out her cargo, and after 18 hours is off again tomorrow for a month or 2, end quote. The quick turnaround time and intense work time at port, the paucity of leisure time, and the distance between oil terminals and the city also translated into a life of isolation for the workers aboard tankers. The New York Times piece that I just quoted casts a less jaundiced eye on this life of solitude and relative isolation. They said, one advantage in his way of life may be the money. He's usually somewhat better paid than the freighter man, and he can save a lot, for there isn't much to spend his wages on, always looking on the positive side of everything. The oil-loading ports in faraway islands are isolated, not near the white lights. This is still New York Times. A man can use up most of his day in the port getting to and from the nearest hotspot. So essentially, what container terminals are today, the oil ports were back then. Both government and shipping company records show such turnaround time at the port of Bahrain, for example, which was between the 1930s and the end of the Second World War, a major loading point for refined products from both Bahrain and the oil fields of Saudi Arabia. And in fact, all of the records for that period, from the 1930s and 1940s, showed that the oil was always loaded and unloaded and sent on its way in fewer than 24 hours. And in fact, in 1957, the average turnaround time was already down to 16 to 18 hours. At port, tanker crews were required to be more involved in loading and unloading than on dry cargo ships, and this also shifted the burden of work to the seafarers and also saved money on having dock workers who were often quite contentious and earned higher wages. Automation had always been the holy grail of capitalists looking to cut costs. Using pipelines certainly served this purpose. Standard Oil's pipelines cut out the Teamsters, and Nobel Oil's the Cossack Arabe drivers of Azerbaijan. But the problem with pipelines is the limitation on the size of the pipes, but perhaps even more significantly, the border crossings that make pipelines vulnerable to geopolitics. More significant still is that pipelines can be sabotaged, effectively acting as a choke point on production. Maritime transport, in contrast, was scalable, more flexible in its carriage capacity, and immune to crossing contentious land borders. To make maritime transport of oil invisible, so as to immunize it against sabotage, oil terminals were also moved away from city centers. In both the case of oil terminals and container terminals, logical explanations abound for moving docks away from city centers. More space for container storage, health and safety reasons for loading fuel on board ships. Though actually crude oil is generally so heavy and stable and not considered volatile, like the refined products, that in fact you could have crude oil loading companies right in the middle of a city and it doesn't affect it. Refined products are slightly different because they're more volatile and they produce more gas. But I've been reading all these memoirs of captains, and a lot of these captains who actually served on both collier ships and oil ships would tell you that the collier ships produced a coal gas that was actually more dangerous than, and far more volatile than plain crude. Kerosene was different, gasoline was different, but plain crude was actually quite heavy and stable. So one of the things that was invented for oil tankers was single buoy moorings and offshore oil terminals that were both distant, and they were, so they distanced the loading and unloading of tankers from city centers, and they made the ships less subject to sabotage or attack, but they were also away from population centers where politically irrepressible crowds of workers could be supported by populations and sabotage the work of shipping. This attempt to automate workers out of existence wasn't always successful. Even with a handful of people needed at the terminal, the oil companies had to contend with highly skilled laborers who could down tools or even sabotage the very expensive equipment. Bringing in scab labor was also not always possible. During one 1968 strike in Qatar, think about this, Qatar, which is like this docile, supposedly place which keeps all of its workers docile. But during one 1968 strike, the Qatari deputy ruler offered the oil company, which was a British subsidiary of, a local subsidiary of British Petroleum, offered them replacement workers to the oil company. But the oil company politely refused the offer, and I quote from the British Petroleum Archives, partly because marine operations could be dangerous with inexperienced workers, and partly because the company did not wish to provoke sabotage on its equipment, end quote. But also, oil brought out from underground is of no use if it cannot be circulated. And the shipment of oil is dependent not only on dockers, terminal workers, and seafarers. So even if you keep all of these people under control, there are still others that can potentially affect shipment of oil. So in 1961, during a two-day strike in Doha, again, Qatar was quite contentious in the 1960s, pilot boat crews stopped working. Pilot boats are, of course, the small, powerful boats that are captained by seafarers with deep and extensive knowledge of a given port's contours and dangers that help larger tankers or larger other ships berth at the terminal because they know the layout of the ports, and so they guide the ships in. The strike of pilot boat crews meant that although Qatari oil was produced and tanked to the storage tanks at Said terminal, once those storage tanks had reached their capacity, oil could not be shipped, nor could it be pulled out of the ground. This meant that workers, in fact, had quite a great deal of leverage over how much oil was to be shipped. In this case, the oil company was supported by the Qatari government, whose police force went in and violently suppressed the strike. So there were moments of these strikes happening, and they were actually, for a brief time, effective in stopping oil transport. So this is the anticipation of automation. But tankers also anticipated offshoring. A longer-lasting and insidious method of disciplining labor was the introduction of flags of convenience, or in effect, offshoring of shipping ownership. Open registries, which is the polite name for flags of convenience, is where ship owners can flag their ships to a different country's flag. Flags of convenience is a term that International Transport Workers Federation has called these open registries. In the words of the sublime John McPhee, the essayist, the convenience of the flags of convenience is that taxes could be avoided, insurance could be to a considerable extent ignored, and wages attractive to ship owners could be paid to merchant sailors drawn from any part of the world, end quote. The world's most famous flags of convenience today are Panama, Liberia, and Marshall Islands, but they also include others like Cyprus and Honduras and Bahamas, all of which are steadfast allies or clients of the US. Open registries, at the time of their devising in the early 20th century, were analogous in some ways to the concessions granted to British companies by British colonial officials. They were an overseas bounty given to a metropolitan company by the metropolitan colonial power at the expense of the overseas country. In Panama, Liberia, and Honduras, the companies that were set up to manage the ship registries were either headquartered in the US or they were operating according to US corporate guidelines. The most egregious example was Liberia, where Edward Stettinius, who was formerly Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of State and ambassador to the UN, set up a registry whose headquarters are still located in Vienna, Virginia, and who repatriates a substantial portion of the fees collected for ships to register under the Liberian flag to the US. The original contract that Stettinius signed with Liberia was 60% of the profits would go to the corporation that's still based in Virginia. 10% went to a development fund set up by Stettinius to encourage investment in extractive industries, including both palm oil and other kinds of minerals. And only 25% was given to the Liberian government. As Rodney Carlyle, the prime historian of open registries, writes, quote unquote, for public consumption, Stettinius promoted the operation in non-profit humanitarian terms. For other, more specialized audiences, such as investors or Liberia company executives, Stettinius hinted at the profit possibilities in the rich iron deposits at Bomi Hills, which rivaled Swedish ore for purity. So essentially, it was a combination of extractive industries and sort of service, extraction of service profits. From the very first, extraction on colonial terms was interwoven with shipping in the most exploitative, profit-maximizing form possible. The earliest ships to be flagged to the Panamanian and Honduran flags of convenience were the banana boats of the United Fruit Company and the tankers of Standard Oil. Standard Oil was the parent company of both the Bahrain Petroleum Company, BAPCO, and of Aramco. So the statistics from the port of Bahrain in the late 1930s and early 1940s show a large number of Panamanian ships regularly visiting the two ports. If in 1900, 50% of the world's oil-carrying fleet had been flagged to Britain and only 3% to the US, by 1948, 10% of the world tanker tonnage was carried on ships flagged to Panama, and this is in the space of 20 years. But US tankers dominated the flags of convenience all the way until the present. In 1970, for example, 65% of all tankers flagged to Panama and 40% of all Liberian-flagged petroleum carriers were US-controlled ships. In 2018, the vast majority of the tankers in the world are flagged to Marshall Islands, Liberia, Panama, and Singapore. International Registries, Inc., which operates Marshall Islands Open Registry and represents the country in international maritime conferences, is based in Reston, Virginia. At various conferences, it's also interesting that Virginia ends up being the suburbs of DC, not even on the coast. Suburbs of DC end up being headquarters for open registries. At various conferences that have attempted to limit emissions from ships in order to prevent climate change and attendant rise in sea levels, international registries, which represents Marshall Islands, has vetoed any effective action, ironically increasing Marshall Islands' exposure to oceanic inundation through climate change. Flagging ships to Panama, Liberia, or Marshall Islands is not only one way to hide incomes from taxation or polluting machinery from inspection, but perhaps more significantly, it is a way to pay crew members less. The absence of regulatory strictures means that ship owners could set wages in ways that best benefit them. Onassis, for example, was known to pay Greek and German crews better rates than other nations, even if its crew members were massively underpaid because they were flagged to Panama mostly, in comparison with US, British, or Norwegian ships of that time. US shipping companies had already pioneered moving their flags of convenience way back when, but when in 1963 the Supreme Court ruled that maritime unions had no say in this, the shifting of fleets accelerated. In 1982, and this benefited the oil companies massively. In 1982, for example, Exxon, which is the child of, or it is Standard Oil Company, Exxon reported that tankers carrying 28 seafarers had to pay $2.5 million in wages if flagged to the US, but only $560,000 if flagged to the Philippines, so one of the flags of convenience. Beyond flags of convenience, the ownership structures of tankers themselves reflect the peculiarities of the age in which they operate. Vanessa Ogle has argued that offshoring has been a device to protect capital from redistributive demands emerging in the colonial era. Aside from flagging of ships to offshore havens with open registries, other techniques have also been crucial to maintain control by Western oil companies over the resources of overseas countries. While John D. Rockefeller had refined monopoly control over downstream production of oil domestically, others had already begun to do so internationally. Again, the Nobels of Sweden were masters of vertical integration of oil production and delivery logistics, controlling every step of the circulation process, including not only the earliest tanker steamships, but also storage depots, oil terminals, tank trains, and repair yards. Shell Company similarly owned all the portside infrastructures it established for delivery of bulk oil in Southeast Asia, but also took advantage of the colonial infrastructures used for resource extraction in order to distribute the oil from Singapore inland. Not only did Shell hold a fast grip on both ships and ports, it even provided coal bunkering to ships in Singapore, thus ensuring total control over all forms of shipping business and sheltering its nascent oil distribution network from competition from collier businesses. It took until 1919 before Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later BP, and other oil companies to begin to develop a worldwide network of bunkering stations to encourage the sale of their fuel fed by tank ships. But until that moment, some of these shipping companies held total monopoly control, total vertical control over one area. Facing decolonization, the oil majors were quite content to set any form of competition aside and instead build something of an iron wall against anti-colonial forces. For example, after Mossadegh's attempt to nationalize Iranian oil in 1951 and Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal a couple of years later, the majors collaborated in, and I quote from somebody who was very positive about this form of oligopoly, the magnificently efficient international distribution system designed and set up jointly by them during those years. Crude oil production was controlled by them. This is the Seven Sisters, which are 5 US companies plus BP and Shell. Crude oil production was controlled by them and efficiently regulated. Export lifting was run by them, and the individual requirements of world crude oil buyers was coordinated by them. Joint working groups assisted individual port authorities to plan and finance channel dredging, berths, tugs, and other services. The majors set up joint oil crude pipelines all over Western Europe, built and ran refineries both separately and together, even marketing jointly in certain areas. In many instances, they were not Seven Sisters, but one all-embracing mother. This is the same positive kind of thing. I love the gendered language. The international oil supply network set up by them was highly efficient, and tankers were an integral part of this coordinated world scheme. The negative side of their cooperation was to be seen in the oil market, but in the tanker market, only the positive was experienced. End quote. Oil company control over tankers wasn't the only modality of profit extraction. So they had a complete and total oligopoly. Well, they had a massive control of the market. By the 1970s, though, some 35% of the world tanker tonnage was controlled by oil companies, but by then, where about 20 years before it had been the majority, but by 1970s, it was only 35%. But by then, they had found ways to protect themselves through other modes of control. So one of them was, for example, chartering or leasing ships from ship owners, through throwing businesses the way of independent tanker fleets, and using punishment and reward to keep these independent ship owners, including people like Onassis, for example, keeping them close to their chest. In 1970, for example, Greek shipping controlled 17% of the world's tanker fleet, and they chartered a huge amount of it to the oil companies. Control over the means of transport also translated into sovereign control over one's policy of distribution. As early as 1959, an Arab nationalist lawyer of Palestinian origin who was working in Kuwait as an oil bureaucrat, and who was later to become the OPEC Secretary General in 1965 to 66, representing Kuwait, his name was Ashraf Lutfi, wrote in a book called Arab Oil that, and I quote, "Security for the future can only come by entering the business of integration. Tankers will ensure that oil can reach the buyers. Ownership or part ownership in refineries through the world will ensure the sale of products. If necessary, the owner of crude oil should also possess the petrol stations selling gasoline and lubricants." My father was a communist in Iran, and one of the things that he used to say was that the control of the crude was not as important as being able to control the refineries and the shipping, which actually then distributed the oil. People who are my Facebook friends know that I was desperately trying to find a quotation about drinking oil, because apparently somebody, either Mossadegh or Nasser or one of Nasser's people, had said that you have to sell the oil because you can't drink it. And so these downstream businesses were hugely important for the sale of oil. And Ashraf Lutfi, the Arab nationalist, was recognizing this. Oil nationalists, and Christopher Dietrich's wonderful book about oil nationalism talks about this to some extent. Oil nationalists knew that controlling downstream businesses where value was typically added and the modalities of circulation were the necessary condition for sovereign control over their crude oil resources. But even in 1976, OPEC nations only owned some 3.5% of the world's tanker fleet. And even today, that percentage is teeny. OPEC countries, the producing countries, don't actually fully control the distribution of their own oil. Kuwait Oil Tanker Company was an historical exception to the OPEC producers not having control over their oil shipping. Actually, it predated OPEC by a few years. But the story of its emergence is also the exception that proves the rule. Given how profitable tanker shipping had been in the 1950s, BP's tanker subsidiary has been in operation since 1919, and in that, well, I guess it's 100 years now, actually longer than that, it has only been unprofitable for 1 year of the 100. It's made a massive profit in all of those 100 years, so it's a very lucrative business. Given how profitable tanker shipping had been in the 1950s, the oil majors who owned tanker businesses did not want competition from regional shipping companies. In the 1950s, Kuwaiti merchants decided that investment in a new shipping business could, and I quote, "take the place of the slowly dying long-distance trade by the dhows," by the traditional ships. The merchants had shipping experience, access to capital, and a state-supported and protected market in oil. However, the state, the Kuwaiti state at that stage, was a British protectorate. And so the Kuwaiti emir had to get the approval of the British for the establishment of this tanker company. There was also an important demand and there was also a huge surge in demand for production of Kuwaiti oil in the aftermath of nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian oil company in Iran. And Kuwait's refinery had replaced Abadan as a source of refined products alongside the one in Aden. So the British, who controlled Kuwait under a protectorate agreement, at first balked at such a venture and denied permission for the establishment of a rival to BP's own shipping company. But eventually, hoping the new company would order ships from British shipyards, and also terrified of these nationalist movements that were rising at that moment all around the region, they relented. They in particular wanted to throw a kind of a bone to the Kuwaiti merchants, who were quite very active and ardent supporters of Nasserist pan-Arabism and nationalization. So they were trying to in some ways buy them out. Kuwait Oil Tanker Company was founded in April 1957 and promptly, instead of ordering ships from British shipyards, ordered ships from the Japanese Seisbo shipyard. And it was one of the earliest to do so, along Daniel Ludwig, who was a very secretive American independent tanker owner. The Kuwaitis and the Americans were the first to order from Japan. From then on, the Kuwaiti Oil Tanker Company put its ships at the service of Kuwait Oil Company, which was a joint venture between BP and Gulf Oil, under a time charter system which guaranteed its stable income over time. It also provided shipping agency services to other tankers visiting Kuwait. The company's business remained fairly stable until the closure of Suez Canal in both 1967, for 7 years, dramatically transformed the physical structure of the shipping market, with larger ships becoming more prevalent. The nationalization of Arab petroleum companies and a surge in US demand for oil in the early 1970s also saw enormous tensions in global petroleum shipping businesses. BP in this period refused to renew its time charter with Kuwait Oil Tanker Company, in part because they wanted to punish the nationalist movements and nationalizing processes in the region. And only an edict by the Kuwaiti ruler requiring Kuwaiti oil to be carried by Kuwaiti tankers saved the tanker company. So you really needed national protection for these businesses, because otherwise they would be punished by the European companies. In the end, the market transformations of the late 1970s resulted in consistent operating losses for Kuwait Oil Tanker Company, and it was fully nationalized, bought off the merchants in 1979. The fortunes of a company owned by a national bourgeoisie was clearly hostage to the whims of the colonial master, who saw in the merchants' offer of a vehicle for the circulation of Kuwaiti oil a threat to their own businesses, and perhaps more so control over mechanisms and routes of circulation, which mattered to them. A third way, which is important about tankers, is anticipating the tyranny of arbitration. The most effective method for protecting the colonial interests of foreign investors in oil and its shipping, however, has been the commercial arbitration in tribunals usually located in Europe or North America, sometimes through the auspices of international organizations, and since the 1960s, the World Bank's International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes. International arbitration was seen as a bulwark against the possibility of sovereign post-colonial states nationalizing foreign assets or taking investors to court in national tribunals over unfair or corrupt practices. Though international commercial arbitration was being institutionalized towards the end of the 19th century, and with the colonization and capitalization of the globe, the call for international arbitration by Western capital became much more clamorous in two specific periods. First, following on the 1920 nationalization of Azeri oil by the Soviet Union, and especially after the 1938 nationalization of Mexican oil, so that was the first period, and the second was in the wave of decolonization that succeeded the Second World War. After the Mexican nationalization, all oil companies added stabilization clauses to their concession contracts, which, quote unquote, froze the provisions of national system of law chosen as the law of the contracts at the date of the contract. This was in order to prevent future alterations after nationalization. They also began stipulating international tribunals as the venue for resolution of any such disputes. So if the Iranian oil company was going to be disputing the, let's say, British Petroleum, if the Iranian government was going to be disputing British Petroleum's holding in Iran, they could not pursue that court case in Iran itself. They had to go petroleum companies were stipulating that these had to be resolved in international tribunals. And this was really interesting because as early as 1951, one of the issues that Mohammad Mossadegh had struggled for in his nationalization of Iranian oil was precisely that the court case should not go to international arbitration. It should be pursued in Iran itself. He didn't succeed. Arguably, the moment during the process of nationalization of OPEC oil in which the most capitulation to the demands of international companies took place was when, over the objection of oil insurrectionists, so the radicals, the gradualists, mostly coming from the Gulf countries, agreed to moving all disputes to international arbitration. So this was a moment of total capitulation. Of course, arbitration was not the only method used by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company to punish Mossadegh. The company conspired with all the other oil majors to boycott all Iranian oil, so nobody could go and lift oil from Iran. There was clear knowledge that without tankers and without Anglo-Iranians' worldwide system of distribution, the Iranians would have no outlet for their petroleum. Not only did the majors boycott Iranian oil, but when a Panama-flagged ship, the Rosemary, chartered by a private Italian oil company, lifted oil from Abadan, RAF, the Royal Air Force planes of Britain, forced it into the Aden harbor. Aden was at that point a colony, where its cargo was impounded by the British. The hijacking of the ship by the RAF had happened at the very moment when the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company had forced Mossadegh to attend hearings at the World Court in The Hague. So it acted as a great deterrence against other oil companies loading crude in Iran. They were both pursuing it in The Hague and through the use of force. The Iranian nationalization of oil and its strangulation through denial of shipping was certainly in the back of the powers, in the back of the minds of the powers in the US and the UK, when Aristotle Onassis again came to center stage. Now, if you recall, Onassis had become a major tycoon through betting on oil tankers. Onassis's astonishing rise and rise through the prosperous ranks of global tycoons gave him a confidence that only one of the world's wealthiest oil companies could deflate. In the 1950s, Aramco, remember the Saudi oil company, which was a subsidiary of Standard Oil of California at that stage, had a concession from Saudi Arabia for the production of oil, but its agreement did not specify the terms of export. So they had a concession, I think 35-year concession, to grab as much as oil as they wanted, but that concession contract didn't include anything about who would actually export it. Onassis attempted to subvert Aramco's monopoly over oil transport by lobbying the Saudi government for an exclusive concession to transport the country's oil. This was too much, not only for Standard Oil, but also for the other de facto masters of oil in the region. For a time, fear that Saudi Arabia might follow Iran's example and nationalize its oil reigned. Why else would it want an independent tanker company to produce its oil? To move its oil. So a motley group of concerned actors, from the CIA and the Dulles brothers to Her Majesty's government in London and the other shipping mogul Stavros Niarchos, all came together to defend Aramco against such impudence. Onassis's ships were boycotted by all oil companies, including Aramco's rivals. So his ships that used to be chartered by everybody were suddenly sitting idle. Diplomats and spies flew to Riyadh to lobby the king to withdraw Onassis's concessions. Based on some diplomatic records, very large checks changed hands. As a last resort, Aramco lodged a case, yet again arbitration, against Saudi Arabia and by extension Onassis in a commercial arbitration tribunal in Switzerland. A powerful group of European and North American jurists ruled against Saudi Arabia and Onassis and declared that its oil production concession agreement had given sovereignty over its oil to Aramco, which meant that Aramco also had control over export. It was a decision that defended the right of powerful Western corporations against countries from the global south asserting jurisdiction over their own oil and control over the operation and management of their own trade. The tribunal decided that by signing the concession agreement, Saudi Arabia had ceded sovereignty over its oil entirely to Aramco. Justice Stephen Schwabel, who's a former president of the International Court of Justice, was a young lawyer at that time working on behalf of Aramco in that case. In a later recounting, he declared triumphantly that international investment law and its tribunal, and I quote, dethroned the state from its status as the sole object of international law. End quote. At exactly the very moment when former colonies were becoming sovereign states. So this coincidence of timing, of course, was no coincidence. In part, control over the circulation of oil was seen as the fundamental mechanism for control of oil itself. After all, after Mossadegh's nationalization of Iranian oil, if he could not sell that oil that was pulled out of the ground, what was he going to do? Drink it? Arbitration was seen as a powerful force for the protection of foreign capital invested in former colonies. And such an early and decisive arbitration as the Onassis tanker case anticipated the primacy of this mechanism of discipline in the coming decades, and particularly after the fall of Soviet Union, when these investor-state dispute fora ended up becoming incredibly powerful, and in 90% of the cases ruling for investors rather than for the states. Now, finally, the final way in which tankers anticipate new managerial methods of disciplining labor and securing capital is through new modalities of accounting, financing, and speculation. The main costs in the movement of goods aboard tankers include wages, port fees, canal transit fees. You usually have to go either through Panama or Suez unless you go the long way around, and the cost of bunkering or fueling as offset against income gained from the carriage of goods in bulk. In part, transformations in shipping have occurred because of the ability to cut back in some of these costs. For example, the switch from coal bunker to oil aboard ships was facilitated by the fact that smaller volumes of oil produce higher amounts of energy, leaving more room aboard a ship for cargo. The closure of the Suez Canal in 1956 for 6 months, and again in 1967, in 8 months, and then 8 years in 1967, forced ships around the Cape of Good Hope. What may have been gained in saving transit costs, and Suez was particularly expensive to go through, would be squandered in increasing bunker costs for the longer trip around the Cape of Good Hope. Economies of scale dictated ever larger ships. The larger a ship gets, the more can also be saved on the wages of the crew. So a VLCC, a very large crude carrier, equivalent in tonnage carried to 2 smaller tankers, requires actually 30% fewer workers. So if you have 40 and 40 workers on 2 tankers, you only have, instead of having 80 on a much larger ship, you only have 60. Actually, the numbers are much smaller than that. But these much larger ships, there's a limit also to how big they can be because they cannot be accommodated on all routes, on all coasts, or at all ports. Whether or not tankers can profit from carrying a cargo of oil depends not only on controlling costs, but also on what can be earned for that cargo. A ship can lift oil on what is called a tramp basis, which means from any given port to any given destination from a spot market, where spot pricing, the price that it is at this moment, obtains. Or it can lift oil on contract. So contracts tend to be longer. If it does so on a tramp or spot basis, a ship can buy oil cheaply and remain at anchor, wagering on increases in prices before it delivers its cargo. So when I was traveling on a container ship, when we got to one of the largest fuel terminals in the Middle East, the port of Fujairah, after there had been a dip in the price of oil, and there were hundreds of ships at anchor who had just loaded oil, but they weren't going to go anywhere until the price of the market went up, and then they were going to speed off to the next place to sell it. So there's a kind of an arbitrage going on the price of the cargo. The cost of transporting a cargo of oil can be added to the price of that cargo and calculated based on a given route, or have the price of its transport incorporated in the cost of the oil itself. So you can either have it as a separate line item, or you can have it as just included and folded into the price of the oil. Pricing of routes is not as straightforward either, and includes not only, you don't do it by distance. It's distance, the size of the ship, the size of the cargo, the quality of the oil, but also lots of other things, like what sorts of contract or spot pricing you are, whether the cargo is sweet or sour oil, and all sorts of other factors. Oil itself is priced differently, as you guys know, based on where it comes from. So West Texas crude or Brent or other sets of prices. In 1948, when cheap Arabian oil was entering the market in volume, the majors, mostly American, that controlled the oil in the Middle East, set its price at West Texas levels. So all of them were coming out at, let's say, $10 a barrel. but they paid a pittance in the producing country. So whereas the cost of pulling it out of the ground was, say, like $7 a barrel for West Texas, it was a tiny fraction of that, maybe even less than $1 when you pull the oil out of the ground in Saudi. And so they made a handsome profit by charging US prices. And then, of course, none of this went to the, or very little of it went to the actual country from which the oil came. The majors, in these instances, absorbed the cost of transport, but in doing so also retained control over the delivery of the oil itself by making the oil cheaper than what, let's say, an independent company would have done and would have added a line item for the transport. So they essentially priced everyone else out of the market. Further, the profits garnered from downstream activities in subsidiary companies were rarely included in the calculation of fees paid to the producing nations by the majors who had such favorable concessions to their oil. The financing of shipping also acted as a bellwether of transformation in finance and development, and different trajectories of development worldwide. For example, support from the state was crucial for the creation of the Norwegian shipping industry in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. And today, the Norwegian shipping industry is still one of the independent ship owners, all of whose ships are, of course, registered to open registries in the Caribbean and Bahamas or whatever, are still quite important providers of independent ships for charter to oil companies and others. So the Norwegian shipping companies, and again, those reports that I mentioned from Bahrain showed that actually the largest number of ships were either Panamanian or Norwegian. So those two flags were quite important for carriage of oil in the 1930s and 40s when oil from the Middle East was entering the market. Subsidies, tax breaks, and a raft of other support, including abundant credit, was necessary for the creation of this Norwegian fleet from scratch, much of it dedicated to tanker and bulk transport. Of great significance for financing these ships was something called charter-backed financing in the 1920s, which was first developed by Norwegian tanker builders whose ships were used by oil companies under time charters. A time charter is essentially when you lease your ship to an oil company for a given time, a year, 3 years, whatever. Because it is chartered to them, you know that for a year, 3 years, whatever it is, you have a steady income. And so what you could use and what the Norwegians did was to use this as a kind of a guarantee against which they could borrow money. This particular form of financing was later refined by the Greek shipping magnates, foremost among them, guess who? Aristotle Onassis, and Stavros Niarchos, actually. Let's give him his due as well. What charter-backed financing entailed was the guarantee of a long-term charter for a ship, the certainty of whose income over a specified period secured the repayment of the mortgage on the ship. Time charters guarantee incomes for the ships because they're based on upfront contracts rather than the riskier spot loading or tramp shipping business. Aristotle Onassis developed loan complexes that involved lenders, insurers, shipbuilders, and the oil companies that were his primary charter customers. And once he had secured a charter on an as yet unbuilt ship, he obtained insurance for it and used the insurance as a guarantee for a bank loan to build the ship. I mean, it's a brilliant kind of a scheme. But it still works because there was an upfront contract and a guaranteed income. But interestingly, this is also where the tankers again anticipate financialization. Since the 1970s, commercial banks have switched from charter-backed financing to something called asset-backed financing, which is like a mortgage. So essentially, you're saying your ship acts as your as your asset, as your guarantee that you're going to pay off the loan. But of course, if your ship's going to be sitting idle, then it's not going to be making money, so you can't guarantee the payback of the loan. In some ways, this change has been in line with financialization of capital, as asset-backed financing is less restrictive than charter-backed lending. With a charter, shipping businesses and therefore income are both guaranteed, whereas with a ship as the security, there is no guarantee of a cargo for the said ship. The relaxation in rules of lending was in part in response to the boom in the oil boom in the 1970s, which saw a surge in demand for tankers and consequently for financing the new ships. When the shipping cycle reached its nadir in the mid-1980s, many of the borrowers defaulted on their loans and a great many ships had to be scrapped. As Elizabeth Sibilia has written in her Oceanic Accumulation, an article that I highly recommend, it's wonderful, whereas charter-backed financing encouraged long-term contracts and stable development of shipping, asset-backed financing, essentially a form of mortgage with the ship as equity and guarantee, emerged in a period of rising oil prices, upward spirals in spot pricing, and thus intensive speculative financialization of the tanker industry. So in some ways, again, the tankers anticipated what was going on in the world of finance. Another major transformation in shipping finance has come with the 2008 crash. Whereas before the 2008 crash, no Chinese firms had been among the top 15 maritime lenders, the big lenders that lend for ships, the contraction in financing saw a number of long-standing European commercial marine lenders, including Britain's Lloyds and RBS, winding down their maritime lending business, while others reduced the volume of their lending, for example, Germany's Nordbank and Commerzbank. The Korean Export-Import Bank, which was already in the top 15 list, has now surged to number 5 in the shipping loan portfolio league table. It was joined by, in 2014, it was joined by 3 Chinese banks, Bank of China, China Exim Bank, and China Development Bank. So the geographic availability and sources of finance to shipping today also is a bellwether of the shift of the location of capital worldwide, as a lot of this financing is now shifting to China. So in conclusion, in the 3-decade period after the Second World War, European states and Japan built thriving social democracies, and decolonization in much of the global south brought with it its intense, though non-linear processes of capitalization and industrialization. None of that would have been possible without the maritime transportation of oil. Even today, flying over Gibraltar or Bab el-Mandeb or Malacca Strait, the profusion of tankers amazes. We often attend to the logistics of container transport because it's such a clear prism through which to study the global value chain. But the humble and too often forgotten tanker has anticipated these global transformations wrought in the 20th century more than any other business. More than any other, it has held a mirror to the techniques of control and discipline in response to mobilized workers at home and decolonization abroad. In her Accumulation of Capital, Rosa Luxemburg insists that imperialism is about 3 fundamental characteristics: of loans extended internationally, of extraction of natural resources, and of transport infrastructures that take the mine products to the market. She was at the time writing about railroads, but I think maritime infrastructures are hugely crucial. The history of the tanker transport is in every way the story of global accumulation of capital. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was stunning. Now I want to know how you've changed your mind in the past week.
So what I've changed my mind in the past week is that I actually do want to focus more on the automation and on the financing rather than all the other stuff in between. Because I think the arbitration is really interesting, but I actually write about it quite a bit in my book. And I think the automation stuff is actually, the more I'm reading, and the more I'm reading these accounts of the captains and dock workers who worked in oil terminals, the more it just becomes amazing, and I really want to work on that. It's also the one place where you can actually see, as I said, places like Qatar or Abu Dhabi, which today are emblems or symbols of docile labor, where in the 1960s you see these amazing ferments of labor organization, and often all of it was around shipping of oil. Not even in the oil fields, but in the shipping of oil. So I think, to me, that's really interesting, and I want to write a little bit more about how that moment has actually shaped the subsequent transformations, especially the automation.
Well, if you'll
Any
take
questions?
some questions. Please raise your hands and I'll come.
The crewman on a tanker earns 1.5 times what the crewman on a container ship earns. So that's a substantial difference. And I assumed it was always because those ships are basically bombs. They could blow up. But that doesn't happen very often.
So it's quite interesting. Yeah, the ships don't actually blow up very often. The one thing that might happen, and it's because they have amazing safety things. So, for example, when a ship is being cleaned, the workers are not allowed to walk around the tanker with shoes that have metal studs in them, because even the spark could set off a tanker that's empty and therefore full of gas. The 1.5 time earning is somewhat of a myth. So if you can earn 1.5 times if you're an officer from a country that is closer to Western Europe. When you actually go on those contracts on flags of convenience, that difference doesn't obtain. And there are lots of, it's interesting because there are lots of forums, seafarer forums, in which people are writing, should I go on a tanker ship or should I go on a freighter? And in fact, the seafarers are the ones who debunk the idea that the wages might be better for the tanker ships. And in fact, the problem with the tanker ships is that you, coming into port, you do a lot more work than people on a freighter do. What people on a freighter, when you arrive into port, there are technical stevedores, technically trained to unload the containers or use the winches to unload the bulk. But with a tanker, the tanker seafarers actually have to work at port. So arriving in port is no fun. It's actually quite hard work. So in part that, again, the wage structures that flags of convenience have created have to some extent removed those differences in wages. Go on, tell me what sucks about it, please.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So there was a specific part in the dynamics that you charted that had to do with the they're not renegades, but they're the counter hegemonic forces or actors. And Greece had, or Greek magnates had a role in it, and as we know, Italy had a role in it.
Yes.
Is that something that has to do with more than these countries? Was there a role for colonial mediators or lesser colonial powers, or kind of Southern European, Mediterranean countries, in staging counter major dynamics? I understand this is less to do with automation and more to do with like geopolitics, but is there a more transnational alignment of powers there?
I mean, the fact that Norwegians and Greeks are the two most prominent independent owners is in part because Norwegians and Greeks were part of NATO. Well, they had alliances with the NATO states, or they were close to the US, and I think that actually really helped, certainly the Greeks. The Norwegians benefited from the fact that oil was discovered in large quantities in the Brent fields in the North Sea at a time when their shipping business was actually diving downwards. And so they were actually saved by the discovery of the oil because they were being priced out of the market by the Greeks. And in part, it was because the Norwegians, it took them a really long time before they moved to something equivalent to an open registry. Whereas the Greek shippers were using the open registries from very early on. They had, therefore, exploiting a lot more workers, etc. So there were elements of geopolitics at play. But I also think that it was the specificities of the politics of these countries and the political economy of those countries internally, but also in the way that the shipping magnates in those places had a relationship with the state or not. I actually think that Onassis and Niarchos did so many different kinds of innovations in this business, and they were so incredibly unscrupulous in a lot of the things that they did. There's nothing quite like reading multiple biographies of Onassis to develop a kind of an weird and odd admiration for him. He is such a operator in very weird and odd and quite, I don't want to say attractive, but incredibly compelling sorts of ways, because he used any legal device, any exploitative device, any kind of relationship that he could mobilize, any kind of connection that he could mobilize, any kind of and he set up all of these different kinds of mechanisms. So I do think that in that instance, the role of some of these shipping magnates and the way that they provided a service to the British and to the Americans, Niarchos to the British, Onassis to the Americans, at the very same time that they were actually derided by the British and the Americans as these excuse me, but the oily Greeks, that's what they were called. It was a weird kind of a love-hate relationship between them, which actually helped Greece in a big way to develop its oil business, tanker business in the 1960s. So geopolitics, but also this kind of a weird business set of relations.
Thank you.
Thank you. thank you for everything you say. It's a small question, but I wonder, precisely because you mentioned the strikes in Qatar, etc. I wonder what your argument is doing with the materiality that is at the center of Tim Mitchell's argument, the
Yes.
difference between coal and oil. You seem to be saying that, in fact, the materiality of oil doesn't prevent the existence of choke points and of friction, which can occasion strikes and resistance. Does that disappear? Does your insistence also on the tanker itself actually suggest that there's a particular technology which, automation or not,
Yeah.
is working against the materiality, or
I mean, I think that the argument that Mitchell makes about the materiality of oil is very, very central in the sense that you do see the way that, for example, the dockers who load oil are nowhere near as influential as the old dockers on collieries. So I don't deny at all that the materiality of oil is different. But I also think that until Rolls-Royce develops those ships that apparently just operate without anybody on them, and they arrive in fully ghost ports in which nobody ever operates, which I don't actually think it is going to ever happen, and I'll come to why in just a moment. I think until that moment where humans are completely 100% written out, there are so many points of intersection between humans and the shipping, even of oil shipping, that I think it allows for pushbacks. And I think that, so that one of the examples I gave was not the dockers, it was not the oil workers, it was not the seafarers, it was the pilot boat captains that actually stopped the transport, which is a category nobody had ever thought about up to that point. Having said that, it's also really interesting to me that often in order to stop these forms of, these choke points, these labor choke points on these moments, forms of discipline are not enough. Political forms of control, I mean, forms of workplace discipline are not enough. Political forms of control have to be brought in. And that's why it was so important for BP, or the Qatari Oil Company, which was a subsidiary of BP, to depend so strongly on Qatar's police force to break these strikes, to intimidate people, and later on changing the labor structures in order to essentially import workers that were not Arabs into these oil fields, because the fear was that any Arab could talk to another Arab in their own language, and therefore they could organize. So the political solution, in fact, this is actually in the, and I write about this in my book, it's actually in the British archives where the labor attaché writes specifically that we need to bring people in who don't speak Arabic to work in these fields so as to prevent the possibility of them getting together and organizing. So there was a political solution in addition to workplace labor, in addition to policing of those moments to strike breaking, etc., that was brought in, which even now, even that has not been fully successful, because of course we constantly hear about wildcat strikes in places like Dubai and Qatar, which are immediately broken through deportations, but they still do happen. We don't see them as much, they don't appear so much, but I think they are still there. So I think in that sense, there is a radical transformation from coal, but it's not completely and totally wiped out other forms of labor protest. That's one thing. The second thing is the materiality of the tank ship is itself supposed to also be something that stops these forms of protest. But this is where I was going to say the intervention. There's a really wonderful anthropologist who works on Masdar City, which is this energy-saving city in Abu Dhabi. And she talks about how this entire city is supposed to be automated. And there are these little trains that go around on little tracks, and they're completely automated, they're driverless, etc. And it's supposed to work without any human intervention. There's somebody sitting at a switchboard a long way away. And what Gökçe Günel, this amazing anthropologist, writes is that, in fact, every morning, a cleaner, usually of South Asian origin, has to come with a little brush and brush away the sand from the rail so that the little train can go around without any problem. The same thing in Masdar City is also supposed to operate with solar panels. And again, another person has to go around with a brush every morning and clean the sand off the solar panels for them to work. So despite the fact that these are all supposed to be automated things, humans can't be written out of them. You see this also even in the ghost ports of Rotterdam. You see them in the fully automated or semi-automated ports of Dubai and elsewhere. So my sense is that it's a fantasy, and it's a fantasy that we're moving closer to, but I think we're still a long way away from it. Sorry? They do need fewer crew, but there's also been a kind of a stop to how low they can go on the number of crew. So I think 20, for a very large crude carrier, the number is 28, and it has been 28 since the 1970s. So they haven't managed to lower that from that number. In part because also the engines need repair. And so they have a lot of people that have to, work on the engine. And you have to clean the ship, and you have to make sure that bits and bobs of it still operate. And so those things are not yet, I don't think they have yet invented the technology necessary to completely and totally write out humans out of that. And I think it's going to be a long while before that happens. Partially because labor is still so cheap. I think the moment at which labor someplace becomes more and more expensive, there will be more money spent on trying to automate those more expensive labor out, as they did with all of the different methods that they do here with wage arbitrage, et cetera. But at the moment, it's still possible to have, it's impossible not to have humans.
Thank you so much for this talk. Actually, before I ask my question, I just want to say that my father, who was also a communist in Iran, told me a story about after the CIA coup that overthrew Mossadegh, one of the punishments administered against one of his ministers, I believe it was his Minister of Finance, was he was tortured and forced to drink oil.
Wow.
Yeah. This is a story that I have heard.
Oh my
so
God.
I think the punishment,
I've never heard that
the
one.
punishment for
Was meant to
nationalization was literally, to drink the oil. Yeah. So just wanted to add that to the anecdotal archive. But my question is, I just wanted to hear you. It sort of strikes me that this history that you're telling has a particular importance and resonance right now at this conjuncture where we know we have to transition completely away from fossil fuels for the survival of most species. And I guess I wanted to hear you talk more about the stakes of laying this out for us now so that we have such a clear picture of how tankerization, as you say, anticipated so many of the developments in the global economy and also reinforced a kind of colonial division of the extraction versus the control of actually profits and circulation. And if you could just talk about how this history can resonate for us today in this particular moment of climate crisis and calls for transition.
So one of the most interesting things that's happening in the oil business today, of course, is fracking. And I'm not sure this is I've just written an article which is going to come out in Lapham Quarterly, and so I had to do a bunch of statistical research for it. But do you guys know that the US is now the largest producer of oil as of 2 years ago? So it has surpassed both Saudi and Russia. It is not yet the largest exporter because it consumes most of its own crude. But the reason that it has managed to do so, it has managed to come up and become the largest producer, is because of fracking. So in some ways, it actually seems to me that a far more destructive modality of extraction is being used to bolster the place of the US in producing an extractive good that the rest of the world is saying, please, we're dying under its effects. So I think that's one thing that is important to note. And I suspect that unless there is a radical and widespread movement which engages in some forms of direct action, a bit like the No Dakota Pipeline, this is going to continue unabated. So that's the first thing. The second thing that has been quite interesting to me is that everybody reports constantly on the various kinds of legislation that Trump is overturning in 2016, including, for example, limitations on offshore explorations within certain miles of the border of the coastline. But what doesn't get said in most of this is that Obama had 8 years to actually bring this stuff in. And he seems to have only brought in this regulation in like the October or November, just before he leaves office. It seems to me a kind of a fuck you to the next president, rather than any kind of a thought-through regulatory process. So it seems to me that even for somebody who claimed to believe in climate, in the reality of climate change, there was very little being done on that. So that's also a second thing. That said, I just heard that the New York legislature has actually tried to roll back some of these federal excesses on offshore exploration. And that means that within the boundaries designated as controlled by the state, obviously offshore is going to be banned. But then we know that the federal government has actually control over what counts as the continental shelf, etc. So there's a huge amount going on, and the US is a very good bellwether of this, because what the US does, unfortunately, most other places follow, to some extent. Germany is an interesting one in this case, because Germany is actually changing lots of its fossil fuel dependent plants, lots of its fossil fuel dependent businesses to shift to more sustainable stuff. But then I don't see the UK doing that. I don't see France doing that. I don't see any of the other European states doing that. And China still burns coal in enormous amounts. India is actually now burning coal at rates almost commensurate with China. So I don't know. I'm not very optimistic, unfortunately. I think we're all going to be inundated, or die of cancer from breathing in God knows what.
Thank you for that talk. To answer your query of what sucks about it, for me, what sucks is that you say it's not a book project, and I really want it to be a book project. And I'm not joking. First, a comment, just to speak back to the fracking. As you may know, one of the things that's driving fracking is a new form of finance called reserve-based lending. So the untapped reserves of oil are the collateral, which I see as a really interesting continuity from the charter-backed to the asset-backed.
Yes.
And I kind of wanted to ask you to kind of talk more about that switch, and particularly the way that this change in finance in the 70s is talking to or not the primacy of dollars, and the way that keeping oil sales in dollars is so key to international finance. I'm wondering what effect that had in shipping and the financing of shipping, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. It's a brilliant question. And there are several things going on in there. So in the 1950s and 60s, there was an enormous competition between Britain as a failing empire and the US as the had already risen one, about how to, in fact, denominate oil in sterling or dollar. And Britain had pretty much lost by the end of the Second World War. And I think at that stage, there was no question that the dollar was going to be king from that moment onwards. And the availability of finance in dollars was a factor. But there were other things that going on, and I haven't written about that a great deal here. But there are others who are working on this. And there's a moment at which other havens, other forms of offshoring capital emerge, including the eurodollar, which actually doesn't have anything to do with the euro, but it becomes a mode of financing to protect itself from regulation in Britain. And all of these different things converge in the 1970s with that moment that lots of people mark as being the beginning of sort of neoliberal capitalism. I can't tell you exactly how the denomination of stuff in everything, including oil, in the dollars affected that moment, but I know that a lot of the transformation that happens with the move from charter-backed to asset-backed financing didn't happen in the US, because the US was never a big financer of boats. It was always the Europeans that were financing ships. And they just had an excess of money which they wanted to spend on stuff, and they did so. And they went into these incredibly risky kinds of forms of financing because there was a fantasy about being able to make huge amounts of money off of this, but also because that was also a moment of financial innovation where the loans could then be broken up into different kinds of things that could be the basis for derivatives of various sorts. And so the emergence of derivatives, and derivatives are, again, I write about the derivatives in my book, but I don't talk about it here. The derivatives were a lot more important for other forms of shipping, not for tankers. But nevertheless, that loan that these financiers provided, the banks provided, was included in all of the different things that they then used for other kinds of speculative finance. It's a very convoluted answer, and in part because I haven't done enough research on that very question, but I know that this is what was happening at that moment. Actually, you know The Big Short, the amazing, fabulous film, and they talk about how they learned that they could take mortgages and slice and dice them in a way that they could then use as these different kinds of devices for financing. A lot of that was happening with other kinds of loans as well. A little bit later than the 1970s, but that also became a factor in this kind of financing of shipping, as well as other things.